During World War II, German soldiers faced two overwhelming enemies on opposite fronts: the massive manpower of the Soviet Union in the east and the industrial power of the United States in the west. While Soviet forces often attacked with enormous numbers of troops and tanks, German veterans frequently expressed a different kind of respect for the Americans. It was not fear of sheer numbers, but fear of something far more relentless: logistics. The American military machine did not merely fight battles. It sustained them with a precision and consistency that stunned even hardened Wehrmacht officers. German troops quickly learned that defeating an American unit in one engagement rarely weakened the overall force. Within hours or days, fresh supplies, reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, and even hot food would appear at the front lines. Trucks rolled forward in endless convoys. Replacement tanks arrived faster than destroyed ones could be counted. Air support returned again and again. To German commanders accustomed to supply shortages and fuel crises, this level of operational continuity felt almost supernatural. The Soviet army could overwhelm positions through sacrifice and mass assaults, but American forces overwhelmed through sustainability. German war diaries and post-war interviews repeatedly emphasized this difference. The Americans seemed to possess an industrial artery that could not be severed. Even when bridges were blown or roads destroyed, engineers rebuilt them with astonishing speed. This logistical resilience forced German troops to recognize that they were not simply fighting soldiers. They were fighting an entire continent's industrial output moving forward on wheels. The contrast became clear during campaigns such as Normandy in 1944. After D-Day, German forces expected supply difficulties to cripple Allied momentum. Instead, they witnessed something unprecedented: artificial harbors assembled off the beaches, pipelines laid beneath the sea, and massive truck convoys feeding the advancing armies. The United States had prepared for logistical challenges years before launching the invasion. Portable fuel depots, prefabricated docks, and mobile repair units ensured that frontline troops rarely lacked ammunition or gasoline. German units, by comparison, struggled constantly with fuel shortages. Panzer divisions often had tanks but lacked petrol to move them. American divisions, however, rarely halted for such reasons. German soldiers soon noticed that when they destroyed American vehicles, replacements arrived almost immediately. If artillery shells were expended in heavy fighting, resupply trucks appeared within hours. This consistency demoralized German troops who were accustomed to rationing ammunition carefully. The American approach emphasized overwhelming firepower supported by endless supply chains. It was not just the quantity of equipment, but the reliability of its delivery that impressed German observers. Soviet offensives might throw wave after wave of infantry into battle, but they sometimes lacked consistent coordination and supply stability in earlier years of the war. By contrast, the Americans built their offensives on meticulous planning and logistical calculation. German soldiers realized that no matter how fiercely they fought, American operational tempo rarely slowed for long. That steady pressure, always supplied, always reinforced, earned a grudging professional respect. American logistics were rooted in industrial capacity, unmatched by any other combatant. The United States produced staggering numbers of trucks, tanks, aircraft, and ships throughout the war. But more importantly, it mastered distribution. German troops facing American forces often commented on the endless columns of transport vehicles stretching beyond the horizon. The famous Red Ball Express, a trucking system established after the Normandy breakout, kept fuel and ammunition flowing non-stop to advancing divisions. While German supply lines were increasingly harassed by Allied air power and partisan activity, American supply networks operated with remarkable efficiency. Engineers repaired roads overnight. Bridges destroyed during retreats were replaced rapidly with portable spans. Rail lines were reconstructed with speed. This meant that American offensives could maintain momentum long after German forces expected them to stall. Soviet offensives, though massive and increasingly well supplied as the war progressed, were still often characterized by extreme human cost. German soldiers sometimes perceived Soviet attacks as driven by numbers and sacrifice. American operations, however, appeared mechanical and methodical, carefully supported by artillery, airstrikes, and constant resupply. To German troops, this represented a modern style of warfare they struggled to counter. When fuel shortages crippled German counterattacks during the Battle of the Bulge, American units were simultaneously replenishing their own resources despite harsh winter conditions. This stark contrast reinforced the perception that American logistics, more than manpower, determined battlefield endurance. Fuel was perhaps the most critical difference. Germany's war machine depended heavily on limited oil reserves and synthetic fuel production, both of which were vulnerable to bombing. By 1944, fuel shortages were dubious, crippling German mobility. Panzer divisions often remained stationary because petrol supplies were insufficient. In contrast, American forces enjoyed vast oil resources and a sophisticated fuel distribution network. Pipelines followed advancing troops. Tanker ships crossed the Atlantic in protected convoys. Fuel depots were strategically positioned to minimize disruption. German soldiers quickly recognized that American armored units rarely halted due to fuel shortages. Even damaged vehicles were often recovered, repaired, and returned to action swiftly. The United States emphasized maintenance and recovery units as part of its logistical doctrine. This meant fewer permanent losses and faster turnaround times. German troops sometimes destroyed American tanks only to see similar vehicles return days later. The reliability of supply chains translated directly into battlefield confidence. American soldiers knew that ammunition and fuel would arrive. German soldiers increasingly doubted that their own supplies would. This psychological difference mattered immensely. War is not fought solely with weapons, but with assurance. The certainty that reinforcements and supplies were coming strengthened American morale and gradually weakened German resolve. Another factor was transportation capacity. The United States entered the war with a vast automotive industry. Civilian factories were converted to produce military trucks on a massive scale. The result was unparalleled mobility. American divisions were highly motorized, enabling rapid redeployment and flexible response. German infantry divisions, especially later in the war, relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. This disparity was not lost on German troops. Watching American units maneuver quickly across battlefields highlighted the technological and logistical gap. Soviet forces also increasingly motorized as the war progressed, but American forces maintained superior mechanical reliability and spare parts availability. If a truck broke down, replacement parts were usually accessible. German mechanics, by contrast, struggled with shortages and improvised repairs. This difference in mobility affected operational tempo. American forces could exploit breakthroughs swiftly, while German units often lacked the fuel or vehicles to respond effectively. German officers noted that American logistics turned operational success into sustained pressure. It was not merely about winning a battle, it was about continuing the advance without pause. This capability commanded professional respect. Medical logistics also impressed German observers. American forces prioritized rapid evacuation and advanced field hospitals. Wounded soldiers were often transported quickly to well-equipped facilities. This improved survival rates and morale. German troops, facing dwindling medical supplies and overstretched services, noticed the difference. Soviet forces, particularly earlier in the war, struggled with medical shortages. American efficiency in casualty care reflected broader logistical organization. It reinforced the perception that American war planning accounted for every detail. Air superiority further amplified American logistical strength. Allied bombers targeted German supply lines relentlessly. Rail hubs, fuel depots, and factories were destroyed systematically. Meanwhile, American transport aircraft and cargo ships operated with relative security. German soldiers often faced shortages directly caused by Allied air attacks. This asymmetry deepened their respect for American strategic coordination. Communication and coordination were equally vital. American units maintained reliable radio networks and supply tracking systems. German forces increasingly relied on outdated or disrupted communications. Efficient logistics required accurate information, and American forces excelled in this domain. The Battle of the Bulge exemplified the contrast. German forces launched a surprise offensive, hoping to disrupt Allied supply lines. Initial success quickly faltered due to fuel shortages. American forces, though temporarily disrupted, re-established supply flow rapidly. German troops realized that even bold offensives could not overcome logistical inferiority. In Italy, similar patterns emerged. Difficult terrain, complicated supply, yet American engineers overcame obstacles systematically. German defenders, though tactically skilled, struggled to sustain prolonged resistance against steady Allied reinforcement. German prisoners of war frequently commented on the abundance of American rations and equipment. Captured supplies revealed high-quality materials and plentiful reserves. This abundance contrasted sharply with German scarcity. Industrial output translated directly into battlefield presence. American shipyards launched vessels at unprecedented rates. Tanks and aircraft rolled off assembly lines continuously. German troops understood that destroying equipment did not significantly reduce American capacity. Soviet numerical superiority was undeniable. Massive armies advanced relentlessly. However, German soldiers sometimes viewed Soviet tactics as costly and less coordinated early in the war. American methods appeared more systematic and technologically integrated. By late 1944, German morale was deeply affected by supply collapse. Units retreated not solely due to defeat in sea, combat, but due to lack of fuel and ammunition. Facing an opponent whose logistics remained intact amplified the sense of inevitability. Ultimately, German respect for American logistics stemmed from recognition of modern industrial warfare. The United States demonstrated that sustained supply chains could outweigh even vast numbers of troops. While Soviet manpower crushed the Eastern Front through scale and sacrifice, American logistics crushed resistance through continuity, reliability, and industrial depth. German veterans later acknowledged that they were not defeated solely by enemy soldiers, but by an economic engine that never stopped moving forward. Another major reason German troops respected American logistics was the sheer predictability of American operational cycles. German commanders were trained to exploit enemy weaknesses, supply gaps, communication breakdowns, or slow reinforcement times. Against many opponents earlier in the war, these weaknesses appeared regularly. But when facing American forces, those exploitable pauses rarely came. Even after intense engagements, American units reorganized quickly. Fresh ammunition was delivered, damaged equipment was replaced, and exhausted units were rotated out of frontline positions with impressive coordination. German soldiers began to realize that American setbacks were temporary disruptions rather than structural weaknesses. In contrast, when German units suffered logistical breakdowns, especially late in the war, the consequences were often permanent. If fuel trains were destroyed or depots bombed, there were few replacements available. American supply chains, however, had depth and redundancy. If one route was cut, another was established. If a bridge collapsed, engineers assembled a portable one. This redundancy created operational resilience. German field reports increasingly described American advances as methodical and unstoppable, not because of superior tactical brilliance in every encounter, but because momentum was always restored. That constant restoration of strength forced German officers to confront a harsh reality. They were fighting a system designed for endurance. Soviet offensives might overwhelm through numerical force, but American offensives exhausted German defenses through sustained, calculated pressure that rarely faltered. German troops also noted the American emphasis on combined arms coordination supported by logistics. Artillery, armor, infantry, and air power operated in tightly integrated fashion. But this integration depended entirely on reliable supply. Artillery barrages required enormous quantities of shells, and American forces rarely lacked them. German soldiers frequently commented on the intensity and duration of American artillery fire, describing it as relentless and precise. Unlike situations where ammunition had to be conserved, American gunners often fired in overwhelming volumes to suppress or destroy positions before infantry advanced. This abundance of firepower was not accidental. It was the direct result of industrial production and efficient distribution networks stretching back across the Atlantic Ocean. German units, increasingly forced to ration shells, found themselves outmatched in sustained bombardments. Soviet artillery could also be devastating, particularly later in the war, but early encounters were sometimes less coordinated. American firepower, by contrast, was consistently synchronized with maneuver elements. To German observers, this represented not just strength but organization. It demonstrated a military culture that had prioritized preparation and planning. The realization that every American assault was backed by layers of logistical preparation, fuel for tanks, shells for artillery, spare parts for vehicles, medical evacuation routes, created a sense that nothing was left to chance. That systematic thoroughness earned professional respect from seasoned German soldiers. The Atlantic supply route itself became a symbol of American logistical superiority. Despite German U-boat campaigns attempting to sever shipping lanes, the United States maintained an extraordinary flow of men and material into Europe. Convoy systems, improved anti-submarine warfare tactics, and industrial shipbuilding capacity gradually neutralized the submarine threat. German naval forces had initially hoped to strangle Britain and disrupt American reinforcement, but by 1943 the tide had turned decisively. Cargo ships crossed the ocean in massive numbers, carrying everything from tanks and aircraft to food and construction equipment. German troops fighting in France or Italy understood that behind every American soldier stood an uninterrupted ocean bridge of supplies. Destroying equipment at the front did little to affect this flow. Replacement shipments were already en route. This strategic depth contrasted sharply with Germany's increasingly fragile supply situation. Allied bombing campaigns targeted railways and factories inside Germany, while blockades restricted access to raw materials. The American supply chain, protected by naval and air superiority, remained comparatively secure. German officers recognized that they were fighting an enemy whose logistical lifeline was almost impossible to cut. That realization diminished hope of attritional victory. Even brilliant tactical successes could not offset the state. Addy influx of American reinforcements, sustained by maritime dominance. Psychologically, American abundance contrasted powerfully with German scarcity. As the war progressed, German soldiers endured shrinking rations, limited winter clothing, and insufficient ammunition. Meanwhile, encounters with American prisoners or captured supply depots revealed a different reality. Well-fed troops, standardized equipment, and plentiful resources. German diaries sometimes mention astonishment at the quality of American boots, uniforms, and packaged rations. Such details may seem minor, but they reflected the broader logistical advantage. A soldier who is properly supplied fights with greater confidence. American troops could rely on regular mail delivery, fresh clothing, and consistent resupply, even in harsh conditions. German units, by contrast, often improvised with worn equipment and dwindling stocks. Soviet forces also endured severe hardships, especially during the early years of the war, and German soldiers sometimes perceived Soviet resilience as rooted in endurance rather than abundance. The American model appeared different: efficiency, comfort relative to wartime standards, and steady support. This reinforced the image of a modern industrial army operating with deep reserves. For German soldiers facing deteriorating conditions, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Respect grew not from admiration, but from recognition of imbalance. They understood that morale tied closely to material support, and in that category American forces possessed a decisive edge. In the final analysis, German respect for American logistics reflected a broader understanding of how warfare had evolved. Blitzkrieg tactics had brought Germany early victories through speed and concentration of force. But Blitzkrieg required fuel, spare parts, and secure supply lines, resources that became increasingly scarce under Allied pressure. The United States, meanwhile, waged war as a fully mobilized industrial society. Its strategy emphasized overwhelming production, redundancy, and sustainment. German troops saw that American strength did not depend on rapid, risky offensives alone. It depended on the ability to maintain pressure indefinitely. When one American division tired, another replaced it. When vehicles broke down, repair units restored them. When ammunition ran low, convoys delivered more. Soviet numbers threatened through scale. American logistics threatened through inevitability. By late 1944 and early 1945, many German soldiers understood that even if they achieved local victories, the broader balance could not shift. The American logistical machine ensured continuity of operations across continents. This realization, more than battlefield encounters alone, shaped post-war reflections. German veterans often concluded that modern wars are decided not merely by bravery or tactical brilliance, but by the capacity to sustain armies over time. In that arena, the United States had demonstrated a level of organization and industrial power that commanded reluctant but genuine respect.